Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Reid Mitenbuler, with his book Wanderlust, An Eccentric Explorer, An Epic Journey, A Lost Age. This book is insane. About this guy named Peter Freuchen, Arctic explorer, right? Also, in Hollywood movies. Yeah, that too. And then wins the $64,000 question. This is just the highlights of this dude's life. The picture on the book is insane and absolutely true, as is everything within this book. Reid did a fantastic job. He tells a wonderful story, and it was fantastic talking to him because he talks about it as well as he writes about it. So, let's get to Reid. I'm going to shut up now. And here we are talking Wanderlust, An Eccentric Explorer, An Epic Journey, A Lost Age by Reid Mitenbuler. Reid, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, Reid, let's just, elephant in the room. Is it true that your love of whiskey is how you discovered Peter Freuchen?
Partly true. So my first book was about whiskey. It was called Bourbon Empire. It was a history of bourbon, a history of the American whiskey industry. And it did lead to my discovering Freuchen's story. A friend of mine, he wanted to catch up over whiskey. He had just joined a place in New York called the Explorers Club. And he tells me, you got to see this place. You know, it's in this mansion on the Upper East Side, and it looks like something out of a Wes Anderson movie. It's got a total throwback feel. You've got wood paneling, you've got Persian rugs, you have floor standing globe. There's all these maps on the walls. It looks like it comes out of a different era. You got to see it. So I go to the Explorers Club after hours. So it feels like we're doing something a little illicit almost. Climb this creaky staircase up to the top. It's a room called the Trophy Room. I've been informed they don't call it the Trophy Room. Apparently that's not correct. I don't know exactly what they call it now. But when you go into this room, they've got all these artifacts. There's the hide of a tiger rumored to have eaten 48 people. There's a cheetah, stuffed emperor penguins, all this stuff that all these explorers who have been members over history, like Thor Heyerdahl, Teddy Roosevelt was a member, have donated to the club. This big set of tusks around this fireplace. I think Roosevelt might have actually donated them. So we're catching up over our whiskeys. And because there's so much to see in this room, it takes a second for me to notice this big painting over the fireplace of this man. He's got this big burly beard, peg leg. He's wearing a suit. I mean, it's kind of a funny painting. And I'm thinking, what have you done in order to get your painting over the fireplace in a room like this, in a club like this? You know, I like to think I've got a good sixth sense for a good story. This has to be a good story. So I go up to the painting. There's a little brass plaque underneath it, Peter Freuchen. Okay, who's Peter Freuchen? So I look this guy up, and this story just explodes. I mean, it's just Mark Twain could have written this guy's life. And he's just all over the place. He's had all these adventures. He's constantly defying death. He's a polar explorer. He had a career in Golden Age Hollywood. He's involved in World War II as part of the Danish resistance movement. And then all those little odd things like, you know, he won the $64,000 question, which was the most watched game show of the day in the 1950s in America. He's living in all these different countries. He's a little bit like remember those beer commercials for Dos Equis, the most interesting man in the world? He's a real life version of that guy. It's kind of photobombing history in a lot of ways. It's like, oh, there he is with Herbert Hoover. You know, there he is with Juno Barnes. You know, there he is with Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's just this amazing life. But what really captures me about his life, like this book, it's a biography, but biography wasn't really my primary goal in writing it. I realized that you have the 20th century. And the 20th century is shaped by all these forces, political, economic, cultural, and all of those things collapse down to the smaller scale of Peter Freuchen's life. So he really becomes a lens. I was like, let's use him as a lens for exploring the century and all these different forces that shape that century, because he somehow plugs into all of them. You know, the politics with World War II and authoritarianism and the rise of that, colonialism with the exploration. You've got culture with Golden Age Hollywood. He made what at the time was the biggest movie ever to have been made. And then you also have another entertainment story with television and how his fame is just boosted even more when he wins that game show and becomes a household name in America. So all these different things that shape the time he lived in can be focused down to his life, and it all comes through, and it's just wild to watch. And it's like a much more burly version of Where's Waldo. It really grabbed me, and I knew right then, like, this is the subject of a book.
I mean, he is the Arctic explorer Forrest Gump is what I'm seeing.
Yes.
And I mean, for an author, it's got to be, because there are some books where you can tell the author's like, all right, I got to kind of pull this all together and elongate this. I feel like with Freuchen, you have the opposite problem, which is, how do I not make this a 3,000 page book, right? Because it just seems like he's a treasure trove of everything, right?
Yeah, with a book like this, the challenge is figuring out what to leave on the cutting room floor. And there were a lot of stories that I totally had to cut out. Where you can tell when you're reading it, I would make a brief reference to it. And it's something I could have gone on for about 5 pages. That was the joy for me in the research process, was constantly encountering rabbit holes. And you just go down them and you're learning about extrasensory perception, because he had this really good friend who was involved, in that. And Sir Herbert Wilkins ended up forming his own religion. So then you're getting into that. And that religion, had an influence on Jerry Garcia and Jimi Hendrix and L. Ron Hubbard, who started Scientology. So it's just going in all these wild directions. So I'm collecting all this information, and then you've got to craft it into a story. And Freuchen, it was a very picaresque journey, to use a word I learned in high school English. You're just lily padding kind of from one story to another. And sometimes those stories aren't really seemingly connected. It's like, well, here he is in the Arctic. Here he is in South America, just popping up all over the place. And so the challenge for me was also finding the themes that did connect all these disparate moments in his life. And the big one was the Arctic, because he went up there, he lived there for almost 20 years. He became part of an Inuit community. He married an Inuit woman, and it really shaped him. He loved that culture. He embraced it. They adopted him into their culture, and he learned a lot. And he took those lessons to all of these other places, like Hollywood in the 30s, or, into World War II, or into the United States in the 1950s. The Arctic shaped him and kind of became, a big part of his identity and the way he approached life. So I use that as the theme to connect all of these very seemingly unrelated parts of his life, so that it could all come together and feel a little more cohesive and comprehensive.
And I'd like to make a confession. I had Wanderlust in my queue for a while, and it's over 400 pages, which, for history, it's a little bit on the longer side, not super long. We're not talking Nathaniel Philbrick or anything. But I remember I'm sitting there and I'm like, I want to first of all be able to enjoy this. It's Arctic history. I'm going to love it. I know it. I'm like, but also 450 pages. I got to make sure I'm in the right mindset. And we were talking about this before we hit record. Author Buddy Levy was the one who's like, dude, you got to get on this right now. Like, it's insane, right? So I remember when I was starting, I'm like, all right, 450. I hope we can keep it up. I just want to say on the podcast, for the record, this doesn't feel like 450. This feels like 200. Like, even the $64,000 question, I'm like, oh, he cut out at least 100 pages on that alone. Like, dear Lord. I mean, I really think it's the perfect length, but also it feels so easy going through this because Freuchen was all over the place.
Yeah, it's a great point. First of all, thank you, Buddy Levy. But, a story needs to be the length it wants to be. And, funny behind the scenes moment on this story is I had originally pitched, like 100,000 words, and the book came in at closer to 135. At one point, I'd gotten it up to close to 150, and I was kind of experimenting with the length. And my editors were like, this is really interesting. We never say that. Editors are always like, cut, take stuff out. And I got a number of points. They're like, this is actually really interesting. If you could elaborate just a couple paragraphs, like you're good at that, just elaborate. And I turned in a later draft that was longer than the first draft. And they came back, and my one editor was like, I never say this. This works better. It's better longer, because it doesn't read longer. It reads pretty fast because this guy's life just moves at a lightning pace. Yeah, that was refreshing to hear. And it's good to hear because, it could have gone a lot longer. And at times I wanted to, but you got to respect people's risk strength. They don't want to hold up a book that weighs that much and get carpal tunnel.
Well, let's talk directly about him. Peter Freuchen. Where is he born? How does he end up in Greenland? And how does this, that's really his love story. So his love story is with Greenland and everything about it. So how does he end up discovering to himself, his discovery of Greenland for himself, and how he fell in love with it?
His life begins with a death, really. He was born in Denmark, and he was born in a comfortable middle-class family, a lot of siblings, and he was a medical student at the University of Copenhagen. Wasn't enjoying it. didn't think that that was a life that he necessarily wanted to pursue. One day, dead man, or man everyone thinks is dead, is wheeled into the hospital. Someone notices that he's not quite dead. This is a dock worker who had suffered an accident down at the docks. And one of Freuchen's professors works to save the man's life. And it took months and months and months. And they basically give the guy his life back. And then a couple of days later, the man is walking around Copenhagen. He's hit by a streetcar. He's brought back to the hospital and he's dead. And Peter Freuchen has an epiphany moment. Now, life is fleeting, and I'm going to grab this thing by the horns and live it to its fullest. And so he drops out of his medical classes and he starts hanging out with the theater kids. Every parent's nightmare, right?
Yeah, he's going the wrong way.
Yeah. And some of his friends in the theater group wrote this satirical play about the Danish explorer Ludvig Milius Erikson, who had just returned from an expedition to Greenland. And they're making fun of him. Freuchen doesn't really like the way that they're making fun of him. He senses that there's more to his story. He had seen Milius Erikson give a lecture about his expedition called the Danish Literary Expedition, which is actually a bunch of artists and anthropologists who had gone up to the Arctic, really more to learn than to conquer anything else. They came back with paintings and poetry and all these things. So it's very romantic for him. Freuchen goes and he introduces himself to Milius Erikson. Milius Erikson recognizes a kindred spirit and invites Freuchen to join as an assistant his next expedition, the Denmark expedition to eastern Greenland. Freuchen tells his parents are actually very cool with it. They had always nurtured his sense of adventure. They knew that this is what he wanted to do. This is what he's going to do. Freuchen goes to Greenland for 3 years, and this is where his life starts to resemble an adventure novel. He's working for a man named Alfred Wegener, who's a pretty famous scientist later on in his life. He came up with the theory of continental drift. He had a lot of discoveries relating to weather, meteorology that helped the burgeoning field of aviation. But Freuchen is doing all this stuff. He's living out in a cabin 40 miles from their ship and their headquarters near the Greenland ice cap, monitoring weather equipment. He almost died. He almost went insane, and all of these things. Goes back to Denmark, tries school again, realizes it's not for him. He liked to learn. He was actually a very studious person who read a lot, but he just didn't like to learn in classrooms. He meets Knud Rasmussen, who's a much more famous explorer, Danish explorer, and he and Knud, they team up and they go back to northwest Greenland, and they decide to start a trading post. And where they live with the Ita Inuit, it's further north than pretty much any other humans on Earth live. That means that they're still living pretty much according to like pretty ancient customs. They're not as influenced by outside forces like missionaries or traders, whalers, anything like that. So they're living with still at that point this very ancient form of life, but it is starting to transition because they are starting to have more contact with the outside world. Freuchen falls in love with their way of life. He falls in love with them as a people. He marries an Inuit woman up there, and he's accepted into their community and lives this form of life with occasional trips back to Europe for the next decade and a half. And that's kind of how it started.
Now, it's very funny, too, and you point this out when he is in, medical school and whatnot. Anybody who has seen the picture on the front of the book will immediately see that this man does not look, he would be a very scary doctor. He's a giant with a giant beard, and even without the beard, he's just gigantic as a person. And it looks like he should be an Arctic explorer. One of those people that's definitely what he should do. But what I did find interesting is this isn't a story where he saw Greenland and he decided, hey, this is for me. It was very interesting that once he started living there, he started to realize this is where I'm happiest. It wasn't necessarily something you snap your fingers. He started living this simple life. And that's really how he kind of started to fall in love with that. And almost, it didn't seem like he ever hated living in kind of the normal European cities, but he just knew Greenland was where he was happiest, right?
Yeah, he loved both. And one of the things that's so fascinating me about Freuchen is he's a man of contradictions, and he's a man who contains multitudes. And he loved this simple form of life, living in the north, living, very close to nature. But he didn't dislike the fancy life. Remember, he was a performer. He was kind of a showman. A lot of explorers, especially of that era, in order to raise money for their expeditions, they'd go and they'd write books and they'd put on lectures and they'd talk. And they were celebrities of sort. They had to be show people. And he certainly was that. So he cultured this image of being very rough and very rustic. But you kind of get the sense that he also kind of liked the fancy life a little bit. One of my favorite details about him, I discovered this through the writings of his third wife, Dagmar, who's on the cover he just mentioned, It was like the man had read Amy Vanderbilt's complete book of etiquette 3 or 4 times, a little bit like my grandmother did. She had several copies of that book around her house. He knew what kind of silverware to use with every dish. Like, if we're going to have this kind of fish, you need to use that. He knew how to set a table properly. And he kind of liked it. He appreciated that. He appreciated, literature, especially Russian literature. He liked going to the opera. He liked theater. He loved movies. He loved culture. He loved the cosmopolitan life. He didn't like to act like he did, or really, that wasn't the image he tried to culture, because he knew that a lot of people saw him as this explorer, and that was kind of his thing. He loved both. And so that's what makes his life so interesting to write about, is because he was going back and forth and was really engaged in both these kinds of lives. That rough and tumble life was almost dying in the Arctic, but then going back and being very sophisticated and engaging in high culture. He ran this gamut, and it was very, very broad spectrum for this man.
Let's talk about love for a second, because I'm not even sure I read it, but I'm not quite sure I understand this particular etiquette. We're living in an Inuit village, right? I am married to a woman, right? I'm about to go on, an expedition. I'm going to be gone 6 months to a year. I may say, hey, Reid, you're a single guy in the village. Can you please move in with my wife while I'm gone? Can you talk me through what sort of expectations might be put on you while I'm gone?
Right. And so it needs to be said, this is another part of the Arctic that I think really appealed to Freuchen, is that to him it represented a kind of Arctic Bohemia. So in the Inuit culture he lived among, polygamy was the thing. They just had very different attitudes about sex and sexuality and marriage, a lot less strict than the Western world that Freuchen came from. There were a lot of rules. There was a lot of scaffolding around these relationships and the social protocols involved. But, men would sleep with other people's wives. Those women would sleep with sailors when they came into town. It wasn't as possessive as the Western European culture that Freuchen came from. And Freuchen writes a lot about this, and he writes about it very elegantly. And, he wrote about it in a way where he was trying to get Westerners just to simply understand it. He wasn't condemning it. He wasn't necessarily condoning it. He can be very objective. This is just how they live. Like, this is how their culture has adapted. And so Freuchen was sleeping with a lot of different people. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed that aspect of it. So did Knud Rasmussen. A lot of explorers did. Freuchen accepted it for how it was. There were a lot of Western explorers who had come to the Arctic and then get a little bit uncomfortable because they saw it as, I'll be able to have a lot of women that I sleep with, almost like they were their concubines. And then they get deeply offended when a woman would be sleeping with them and then crawl out of their bed and then crawl into bed with one of their friends. And you'd see a lot of explorers go, I'm not cool with that. And I quote some of them in the book. Freuchen was kind of live and let live, and I'm going to live how they live. And his first son, Mikusak, wasn't his biological son, but he still raised him as if he were.
Well, you can actually get in a little bit of trouble if you turn down sex with somebody's wife, right? Because there would be certain scenarios where if you said no, you would actually be insulting a whole bunch of people.
Right. It was its own rules. And he wrote a lot about this, explaining it to people. And unfortunately, you don't have writing a lot of times from the Inuit perspective. So the Inuit culture was oral. I mean, they passed down their histories and traditions orally. So we don't have a lot of this written from them. But that's the way Freuchen describes it, is that there were times when he'd be offered someone's wife. And if he were to turn it down, the man would take that as an offense. And he writes that some of the women would sometimes take it as an offense too, because it's like, you don't find me attractive, you don't find me beautiful. Or, one of the other wives, if there was one case, the encounter where a man had 2 wives, where the other wife then kind of felt bad because she hadn't been the one offered. Like, who are you valuing? And, he talks a lot about this. These are stories I wanted to share too, just to take people into a very different time, place, and culture.
Well, it makes so much sense for the rest of the book, too, because, a lot of that has to do with the fact that when somebody left the village, there was a really, really good chance they were going to die. And, that's another thing. Freuchen almost died a lot out on the ice. And this culture was kind of built in a way that, hey, people are not going to get left behind, that the village is kind of wholesale going to take care of each other, and that it had to be a situation where nobody was left on their own. Everybody had to kind of take care of the whole group, right?
Right. And Freuchen's politics, which evolved over time, he's from a Scandinavian country, he's a social democrat, flirted with communism, but later soured on communism, became very wary of it, especially after traveling through Stalin's Russia. And he got to go to Siberia. He was all over Stalin's Russia. And one of the things he preached about Inuit lifestyle was it was very communal. And when he did return to Europe and was starting to miss Greenland, that's one of the things he missed. And he wrote that, up there, I would just step outside of, my tent, my igloo, whatever, and I would go hunting for my needs. And once I had my needs met, you're kind of done. Whereas here, I'm forced to work on this hamster wheel to afford all of these things that I don't necessarily need or want. And he resented that a little bit. And partly, too, it's because his second wife, it was his first wife's this Inuit woman. She died of the Spanish flu. His second wife was a margarine heiress and was used to a much fancier life, was used to much more. And so he's working to pay for this life that's very, very, very different than that life he had enjoyed in the Arctic. Now, I think he enjoyed that life too, but there were moments where he felt like, I'm trapped. I'm trapped by this system, this capitalist system that I'm living in, as opposed to that other life. But he would go back and forth. He did enjoy both. And so a lot of contradictions always kind of going around in his head. And I think that's relatable for a lot of us in a lot of ways. At times we enjoyed this kind of thing, but it might be nice to have that. We want the variety. Freuchen was the same way.
Well, speaking of life, Freuchen almost lost his a whole bunch of different times. Did you try and keep count of how many times he probably should have died but didn't? I feel like it's a large number.
I think a good rule of thumb, he's like a cat, right? And he didn't quite hit his 9 lives, but he came pretty close. So let's go with 8.
8? That sounds good. Well, one of those 8, I don't know if I want to dive too far into the details, but I will say, did you intend to write the grossest escape story of all time? Because I'm going to tell you, you did. Was that your intention?
I did, yes. It's like you go for a big, let's find the grossest escape story, and then that'll be the book. It'll be built around that. For listeners, the story being referred to here, and this is the story that when I first discovered Freuchen, that for anyone first discovering Freuchen, and for anyone who dares tread out onto social media, if you Google his name, this is the thing that's going to jump right out. If I had a time machine and I could go back and tell Peter Freuchen anything, I'd say, look, man, just a few decades after you die, this thing called the internet's going to exist. When people aren't screaming at each other about politics on it, they're going to be talking about your poop chisel story. So you're going to want to be very, very careful about how you present this thing. Now, we don't know for sure that it's actually true. It should be said here, Freuchen was a raconteur. He was prankish. He sometimes liked to tell tall tales. He liked to embellish his stories. I found in my research, the broad outlines of his stories were very true. It was always small embellishments within a larger truth because he was just having fun. He was having fun. He liked to pull people's legs. And the poop chisel story, which he actually did tell to his parents, by the way, within days of it happening. During the 5th Thule expedition, early 1920s, he's in northern Canada. A blizzard whips up. He needs to take shelter, so he takes it beneath his dog sled. He flips his dog sled over, crawls beneath, and he's snowed in. Fell asleep. When he wakes up, he's trapped in what's basically an ice tomb. It's a pocket of air about the size of a coffin. So he's got to get out. So he tries chipping his way out. He's trying to claw his way out. He's using as a pillow a piece of polar bear fur. He takes a strip of that leather. He's sucking on it, waiting for it to freeze. It's probably about 40 degrees below zero, so stuff freezes really fast. Tries to chip his way out with that. And sometimes he would tell people that that's how he escaped. I think maybe in moments where he was just trying to be polite, maybe he's among polite society. He didn't want to tell this other version of the story. But the story that he writes in his memoirs and he would tell in a lot of his lectures was then he felt a pressure in his bowels. And he thinks to how the Inuit, and this is something that the Inuit did here and there if they were ever caught in a bind. So they would use frozen dog feces, shape it into a tool, and use it for whatever they need to use it for. So Freuchen feels a pressure in his bowels, and he takes his own poop, fashions it into the shape of a chisel, waits for it to freeze, and that's how he escaped. And, people who have questioned the story, there's actually several scientific papers out there that I've read through where people tried to recreate this. And they get into these debates. Well, is it a poop knife or a poop chisel? Like a knife can't keep its blade, but a chisel, that's a little, they talk about the fiber content in frozen poop. They really get into it. It's like a peer-reviewed paper, in academia. One of the papers comes out, it can work. You can do it. And Freuchen was aware of the Inuit doing it, and they did do it. So it's possible. It's also possible that he was just saying this to, have fun. He was a showman. He was a writer. He was later on in his life, a best-selling novelist. So we don't know. But I think there's a good chance he did. I think there's a good chance he didn't. We'll never know for sure, but it certainly makes for a fantastic story. What's really interesting to me about the story is that this is the one thing. If anyone knows anything about Freuchen, this is the one thing. For the man who had one of the most interesting lives in the world, This is the thing they know. Oh, is that the guy who escaped from an ice cave with his frozen poop? And you're like, yeah, that guy. But let me tell you about the rest of his life.
Well, if he wanted to be remembered, he nailed it with this one.
Yeah.
I do remember reading this and going, am I hallucinating? I can't be reading. No, really, no. And then, yeah, went all the way through and I'm like, can't get crazier than this. But then again, it still does, because, right, we're talking about Greenland Explorer, and I mean, we're zooming through a lot here. But then, right, we've got World War II. We've got all the Hollywood stuff, right? We've got, as you just mentioned, he's a novelist. I just want to kind of, let's take all the Greenland stuff out of it. Where do you think he had the most fun or felt really that he belonged other than Greenland? Was there certain time frames in his life afterwards that he felt like he was really being fulfilled? Or do you think he always needed Greenland to be able to feel connected to the world?
He would always return to Greenland, because he loved it so much. He had all these friends there and family there. When I think of Freuchen, I think of someone who didn't necessarily have a place where he really belonged. The title is Wanderlust. His place was kind of everywhere all at once. He's always traveling. He's always meeting different kinds of people. That's really what fed him. He's in South America meeting people. He's here, So after being really stationed in the Arctic, I think wandering was really his place. And that's where he felt most comfortable. And he did have Anahoya, which is this little island that he bought in Denmark. It was an operating farm. He made money from it. It's where he did his writing. It's where he lived with his second wife. This lovely little farm. It's now a bird sanctuary. And he would go there to get restored. It's almost like having a dacha or a summer house. He would go there to get restored, but he was always then taking off on some other trip. He needed to be moved. He's like a shark. If a shark stops moving, it dies. Like Freuchen's a little bit like a shark. He needs to always just be moving.
But he also, like that island, it was almost as if, they call him those extroverted introverts, which is he needed that quiet time to kind of recharge, but then immediately he's got to be out the door doing something. And I mean, I think the hardest part for a lot of people to understand would be the way he was with children, right? Because he loved children, liked being around children, but he was away from his own children often. And they were very often on a completely different continents. And I think that was a harder part for me than the Inuit stuff. Their culture was different, but it all made sense, especially the way you explained it in the book. But it seems like with his children, that was probably the most complicated thing he ever had to deal with, where even he didn't seem quite sure that he was doing the right thing all the time.
Yeah, and I should note, and this really isn't in the book, he had a pretty serious correspondence with, he was a big letter writer. And so even when he's traveling and he's away, he's keeping up with people in his life. I talked to some of his family members. He's got a niece and a granddaughter. They're still alive. Always getting letters from every single week, the weekly letter from grandpa kind of thing. So he tried to stay connected how best he could while he's out doing this wandering. And when his kids became older, so Mikusak had some developmental difficulties that Freuchen always blamed himself for. This is the first son, the one who wasn't the biological father of. And Freuchen blamed himself because, a famine had hit Thule and they had to travel to try to find food. And the child was starving and got really sick and was later diagnosed with what the doctors called glandular problems. It was always a little unclear in my research exactly what it was, but he had a lot of problems later in life. Like he had a heavy stutter that kept getting worse and worse and worse. And he had to end up living in a facility. But Freuchen's daughter, Pippaluk, you notice that the relationship as he gets older becomes a lot closer. They were very close. He was a very doting father on her. And he liked to have kids around. He wrote about that. He loved the soft patter of feet. He would write plays for them, for the kids to perform on the island. And this is just part of him being a contradictory person. He loved his kids and he tried to be there, but he was often gone for long amounts of time, which I think was a lot more common for back then. It's like the old sea captain story. It's like that's just the nature of life back then. But they would travel with him, especially as they got older, a lot, actually.
And now I love this because it honestly seems made up. He ends up in Hollywood, right? We talk about the $64,000 question, right?
And Golden Age Hollywood, even better. It's like the glamour of it.
And you just think about this guy that has gone through all of this stuff, poop chisel, all of those things, and then all of a sudden he's in Golden Age Hollywood. But that's really where you're mentioning he knows kind of how to play the game when he's out with people. For the most part, every now and again, he had a couple of stumbles where he probably needed to calm down a little bit. But how does he end up in Hollywood? What does that look like?
Right. So the way he ends up in Hollywood is after he loses his foot. So the incident we mentioned with the poop chisel, gets frostbite. And a few years later, his foot, it was a long deterioration. His foot gets amputated. He's got having this crisis. It's really almost an existential crisis for a man who is so mobile and living all these adventures. He loses his foot. And this makes national news in Denmark. It's like the great Peter Freuchen has lost his foot. And he falls into a deep depression. And his doctors, help him actually with the power of positive thinking. And I love that part of the book. They put him with other amputees who are all very upbeat and cheerful. And Freuchen realizes it's in my attitude. And the second half of his life is just as full of adventure, maybe even more full of adventure than that first half, even though he's lost his foot. He overcomes, and he does it because he's thinking positively. And he always liked to write. He loves stories. I think also, he looks at his partner, Knud Rasmussen, who is much more popular and famous than him. And he's writing a lot of books. He's making a lot of money. Freuchen's second wife is pestering Freuchen. Like, Freuchen, where's your glory? Like, why are you playing second fiddle? So he finally decides, I'm going to write that novel. He doesn't do what a lot of explorers do, which is write. Well, he did later write memoirs, but a lot of them, that's how they made their money and made their names. He decides, I'm going to write a novel and use my experiences in the Arctic to flavor this story. And he writes it from the perspective of an Inuit hunter. And he uses all these stories that he's accumulated over his earlier life. And the novel becomes a bestseller. And it was optioned by a company in Germany. There was a film director named Joe May, who later ended up in Hollywood directing for Columbia under the old studio system. And he had started the careers of Fritz Lang and all these greats. So Freuchen's really excited. Like, maybe this will be my next career. Maybe this will be my next thing. Movies. And he loved movies. And this is still the silent movie era. We're right getting up to talkies. Joe May can't make the movie because of that transition. They were going to do it as a silent and they couldn't get the script right. And then Joe May sees The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson along with Freuchen. And it's just like, this is going to be the future. This is going to be the future. So the project, right when it dies, MGM, which is just starting its ascent as America's big prestige studio. This is the years, Irving Thalberg, F. Scott Fitzgerald is a writer there, William Faulkner, Anita Luce, Ben Hecht, these great screenwriters. They decide to make the book, which in the US was titled Eskimo, into a movie. And it was going to be the biggest movie ever made. The director they have attached is W.S. Van Dyke. Actually, originally, we were going to get Victor Fleming, who later went on to do Gone with the Wind and all those movies. But they get W.S. Van Dyke, who's kind of the James Cameron of his day. He did Tarzan. He later did the Thin Man movies with William Powell and Myrna Loy. A lot of great stuff. And W.S. Van Dyke would do films on location, which they really didn't do a lot of back then. And they want to film the thing in Alaska, in the Arctic. They want to cast Inuit people in roles calling for them. They want them to speak Inupiat, which is a language spoken among Native Alaskans. And, they want this authenticity. They want this layer of authenticity. And that's what Freuchen wants. And Freuchen's novel was critical of colonialism, but not particularly preachy about it. And so they have Freuchen come out to Hollywood. He's helping adapt the script. He's going to be in the movie himself. He plays the villainous sea captain, which I think is funny because, he's criticizing Western colonialism, but then the character he plays is supposed to be the representative of Western colonialism. And it's funny to see Freuchen in the movie because for a man who looks like such a swashbuckler with that big beard and everything, he had a very quiet voice. His voice didn't really match his body. It was a very sweet and sensitive voice in a lot of ways. So it's a little jarring to see him. And when they make this movie, it was kind of a carnival of a comedy of errors in a lot of ways. I mean, it didn't live up to the high ideals in every way that it was trying to achieve, but it did okay. It broke a little more than even at the box office. So it was a success, but it premieres internationally. But while Freuchen's making it, he gets to tool around Golden Age Hollywood. He's going to parties. He's in one of the biggest, most prestigious studios in the city. He's friends with Jean Harlow. He almost gets her in trouble. He's at a party at Van Dyke's house. And there's all these famous people there, like Johnny Weissmuller, who played Tarzan, the big stars of the day. And he picks up Jean Harlow and twirls her over his head. He would sometimes kind of do that. He would do this kind of circus strongman routine and pick women up over his head. He actually did it to Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's chief propagandist, during the premiere of that. He didn't like the Nazis at all, but kind of got in trouble because he picks Leni Riefenstahl. She had relationships with a lot of the top Nazi leadership. But anyway, kind of a weird aside, right? Freuchen would just sort of do this thing. He does it to Harlow. And a paparazzi snaps a photo, and the shot, gets up her skirt. And she apparently isn't wearing underwear. The next Monday, Freuchen is called into the office of Louis B. Mayer, who's a titan, like the mogul. He's kind of the caricature of a mogul almost, stabbing the air with a cigar when he's talking, all this kind of stuff. And he's yelling at Freuchen, like, this is my star. You're going to ruin my star. And he had to pay off the paparazzi, which is pretty common for that era, for the paparazzi to kind of blackmail studios. It's like one of these movies like Hail Caesar, whatever. So Freukhen's tooling around with all these Hollywood personalities. One of my favorite finds is I'm a big fan of old movies. I watch a lot of old movies. Freuchen was really good friends with the composer Dmitri Tiomkin, who represents this emigre community that's living in Hollywood. They've all fled Europe because of the Nazis. And Hollywood in that era really benefited from all this talent that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And you're getting all this great European talent flooding into Hollywood, and you're about to get just an awesome period of Hollywood history because of this, because it's just such a concentration of so many great artists. And Freukhen's friends with a number of them, and Dmitri Tiomkin's one of them. He did the soundtracks for Red River, John Ford movies, Alfred Hitchcock, some Alfred Hitchcock movies, all kinds of things. And I was going through Tiomkin's memoirs, and he talks about meeting Freuchen for the first time. And it's such a great picture. And it really demonstrates a lot about Freuchen, because, he's always presented, especially go on the internet, he's always presented as, people are like, he's such a badass, blah, 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 like all this kind of stuff. That's the language they kind of use. But here's a different picture of Freuchen. Dmitri Tiomkin, who is this wonderful artist, he's really into, Russian literature and Russian music. He's on the lot at MGM, and he looks over and he sees Freuchen. He sees this guy with a peg leg, big burly beard, and he's standing there, and he's in front of a shrub, and there's this butterfly. And he reaches out, and the butterfly is, on his hand, and then he kind of lets the butterfly back into the bush. And Tiomkin's like, you look like something out of Treasure Island, like you look like Long John Silver or something like that. I was like, who is this man? Just standing here on the lot, this 6.5 foot tall, guy with just very gently holding a butterfly. So he becomes friends with Freuchen, and he would invite Freuchen to his house. And his wife was a very famous choreographer. And she would have ballerinas, probably people performing in Busby Berkeley films and things like that. They'd have ballerinas over the house to have these pool parties. And Tiomkin just writes about Freuchen. He goes, all of these ballerinas are dipping into the pool, barely making a splash. And then Freuchen would jump in, and then he would come bounding out of the water like a whale. And his quote is something like a sea god among the mermaids. And it's just such, Hollywood is just such full of great, interesting, and he's writing about it in this great old Hollywood way, like a sea god among the mermaids, this man, swimming among the minnows, like that kind of thing. And so that it's just such a great picture. It was one of my favorite finds, is to see how other people responded to Freuchen and how they wrote about him in their own memoirs and correspondence. So here he is in this town in this really interesting period in the town's history, making movies, telling stories. And he's doing it when the craft of storytelling was really changing away. Like Hollywood's industrializing it, and they're going to export that to the rest of the world. And Freukhen's a part of that, mass scale industrialized storytelling in a way. That's how I like to think about it. And he's doing it by telling this story about these people who a lot of people misunderstood or didn't know much about, the Inuit. And he was trying to portray them in a way, there were a lot of kind of ugly, noble, savage cliches and things like that at the time, how people talk about him and using terms like that. And he just wanted people to see them as people, just like you or me. They're individuals, and some of them are good, some of them aren't. Some of them are more enjoyable than others, but they're just people, just like us, but they're living a different sort of life. And he was trying to humanize them and bring them to other people. That's the story. That was the big story he went to Hollywood with.
And we've talked about this. This is obviously an absolutely epic life. So why isn't he more well known? I mean, for instance, you had to see him in that photo. For me, I love Arctic Anything, and I've never come across him until now. Is he just overshadowed by the people around him, like, Knud Rasmussen, or why don't we know more about him?
So while I was writing this, I like to think of Freuchen as the Scottie Pippen of polar explorers, right? Scottie Pippen, was maybe the second best person in the NBA at the time he was playing. Unfortunately, he just had to play under possibly the greatest player of all time. So Freuchen was never number one on any of his expeditions. He was never the expedition leader. Knud Rasmussen was, or Ludwig Milius Erikson was. On the movie, he wasn't directing it or producing it. He helped write it. He was never the number one. And so I think he got overshadowed for that reason. But in his time, he was actually pretty well known. He was known in Denmark. He was very well known in America. And he was known after he won the $64,000. He became a household name. But there's a great commentary on celebrity here in that, in his era, he was known. But it didn't take long for him to be forgotten. When he won the $64,000 question, I was going through old newspaper archives, and there are thousands, literally thousands of mentions, and people recognized him on the street. People knew. And that got me thinking about celebrity quite a bit. And that, you can have it in your own era and everyone knows who you are, but it doesn't take long for it to fade depending on what it is, you did. So it's important to have those close relationships with the people around you, because the things a lot of people strive for, in terms of fame or whatever, it's not necessarily going to last. Unless it's bringing you happiness in that moment, maybe it's not worth striving for. That was a lesson I took away from that, because he was famous in his time, but we've just forgotten him since then. And a lot of his friends were famous. He was friends with Tom Mix. He was friends with Will Rogers, all these famous people in Hollywood, other famous explorers, a lot of very well-known personalities for his time. But all of those names have kind of faded. You'd look them up and you'd see they're all being talked about and mentioned in the newspapers and the society pages, things like that. But a lot of them weren't remembered.
The big question, we founded History Nerds United so that people would understand that history is exciting. It's not boring. But there's still a lot of people out there who think, nope, history is what I learned in school. I don't need to worry about this stuff anymore. If I sat one of those people in front of you who said history is boring, why should I read Wanderlust? What would you say?
I would say that if I had written Wanderlust, if I had written this nonfiction story as fiction, I'd be, people would laugh. They'd be, it's too much. It's over the top. It's too on the nose. But it's not fiction. It's not fiction. It's true. It really happened. And it's a more wild story than you find in a lot of novels. So I think that's what I would say.
It's the perfect answer, and I agree with it.
Real life, when told well, is just as interesting as fiction, for sure.
Well, Reid, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was great.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Reid, thank you so much. Everybody pick up Wanderlust. Trust me, it's as insane as you think it is, and it's all true. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, listen to other episodes of the podcast, head on over to the blog, leave us comments, everybody, leave us 5-star ratings. Everything you do helps. Even if you're just sending us questions, letting us know, hey, what's up? What are you doing? Do this now. We want to hear more of this. We'd love to hear from you. Till next time, stay cool, nerds.